Boethius, the man who mastered fortune. In this documentary, we will break down one of the most extraordinary, heartbreaking, and genuinely illuminating philosophers who ever lived. Boethius, a man who wrote his greatest work in a prison cell while awaiting execution, who constructed from the ruins of his life a philosophical argument so powerful that it became the most widely read book in the Western world for nearly 1,000 years, who placed in the mouth of an imaginary woman named Philosophy a comprehensive account of happiness, fortune, fate, and the good that would shape every major thinker from Alfred the Great to Thomas Aquinas to Geoffrey Chaucer. A man who had been the most powerful official in the Roman Empire, who had devoted his life to reconciling the traditions of Greek philosophy with the demands of Christian faith, who was stripped of everything: his office, his wealth, his reputation, his freedom, and finally his life. And who in the last months before his death produced a work of philosophical consolation that has never been surpassed in its genre and rarely equalled in its ambition. He was not a revolutionary in the manner of Diogenes or a system builder in the manner of Aristotle. He was something rarer and in certain respects more philosophically consequential: a transmitter, a bridge builder, a man who understood that the most urgent philosophical task of his moment was to preserve what was best in the ancient world and make it available to the world that was coming into being. He translated Aristotle into Latin. He wrote commentaries on Porphyry. He produced technical manuals on music, arithmetic, geometry, and logic that would serve as the foundations of European education for centuries. He built the intellectual infrastructure of medieval Europe almost single-handedly, working with the systematic dedication of a man who understood that the civilization around him was in the process of fundamental transformation, and that what was preserved now would determine what was possible later. What Boethius created was not merely a body of philosophical scholarship or a personal meditation on adversity, but a complete vision of how the philosophically educated person should understand and respond to the radical contingency of human life. His Consolation of Philosophy is not a book of comfort in the ordinary sense. It does not offer easy reassurances or conventional religious consolations. It offers something more demanding and more durable: a rigorous philosophical argument that the things fortune gives and takes away are not genuinely good in the first place. That genuine happiness is found in something that fortune cannot touch, and that the apparent disorder of human experience is embedded in a providential order that reason can perceive even when suffering makes it impossible to feel. His biography is inseparable from his philosophy in ways that give the philosophy its peculiar and irreplaceable force. He was not writing about adversity from a position of comfort. He was writing about it from inside a prison, in the shadow of an execution he knew was coming, after a fall from power so complete and so sudden that it would have driven a lesser mind to despair or self-pity. He chose neither. He chose philosophy. And the choice, maintained under conditions of maximum pressure, gives his arguments a kind of existential authority that no amount of abstract reasoning from a comfortable desk could have produced. What you are about to encounter is a philosophy of radical reorientation, a systematic argument that human beings habitually pursue happiness in the wrong places, that fortune is not the enemy of the good life, but a teacher about what the good life actually is, that the universe is governed by a providential reason that encompasses even the worst apparent injustices, and that genuine freedom is available to anyone willing to think clearly about what they actually are and what they actually need. It is not a comfortable philosophy. It was written in the most uncomfortable of circumstances. It is a philosophy that takes seriously a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If everything you have built can be taken from you overnight, what is genuinely yours? And where does genuine happiness actually live? Boethius answered that question from a prison cell with the full resources of a lifetime of philosophical learning, and the concentrated urgency of a man who had run out of time for anything except the truth. The philosophy of Boethius is not something you read and then set aside. It is something you read and then find yourself unable to stop applying, unable to observe the ordinary operations of fortune, the sudden reversals, the undeserved catastrophes, the inexplicable prosperities, without asking whether he was right that these events, however devastating they feel, are not the most important things happening. Unable to look at the things you are working so hard to acquire and maintain, without wondering whether you have made the same fundamental error that philosophy diagnoses in the Consolation, the error of mistaking the image of the good for the good itself, of chasing what fortune distributes instead of what fortune cannot take away. That is what genuine philosophy does. That is what Boethius was doing, and that is what we are going to explore. Part 1. The Foundation, Rome, Power, and the Making of a Philosopher. Philosophy often begins in the margins of the social world, among the displaced and the dispossessed, among people who have been pushed to the edge of conventional life and forced to question its assumptions from outside. Boethius's philosophy began at the very centre, in the court of a Gothic king, in the highest offices of what remained of Roman imperial administration, in a life of extraordinary privilege, learning, and public achievement. Understanding where he started is essential for understanding what the fall meant and what his response to the fall revealed, because his philosophy was not invented at a distance from power. It was forged by the experience of having power and losing it, of understanding from the inside both what power could provide and what it absolutely could not. He was born around 480 CE into one of the most distinguished families of what remained of the Roman aristocracy. The Anici were one of the great senatorial families, ancient, wealthy, and enormously prestigious. A family that had produced consuls, emperors, and popes. A family whose lineage connected the late Roman world to the classical past that was rapidly receding from living memory. The Rome into which Boethius was born was no longer the capital of a Western empire. That empire had formally ended in 476 CE, just a few years before his birth. But it was still a city of extraordinary cultural richness, still home to the old senatorial aristocracy with their libraries and their classical educations and their carefully maintained sense of connection to a Roman tradition that the political changes had not entirely erased. His father died when he was young, and he was adopted into the household of another great aristocratic family, the Symaci, whose patriarch Symmachus was one of the most respected figures in the Roman senatorial class, a man of deep learning, impeccable character, and genuine philosophical commitment, who became the dominant intellectual and moral influence of Boethius's formation. Under Symmachus's guidance, he received an education that was exceptional even by the standards of the aristocratic elite, an education centered on the Greek philosophical tradition, particularly on Plato and Aristotle, that gave him not just acquaintance with the texts, but genuine philosophical competence, the ability to read, interpret, and argue within the traditions he had studied rather than merely to cite them as authorities. He appears to have spent time in Athens or Alexandria, the sources are uncertain, where he supplemented his Roman education with direct contact with the living Greek philosophical tradition, still active in the late antique philosophical schools. This contact with the Greek tradition was decisive for his subsequent intellectual project because it made him acutely aware of how much of that tradition was inaccessible to Latin readers, how much of the most important philosophical work of Plato and Aristotle and their commentators existed only in Greek, in a world where Greek literacy was rapidly declining, even among the educated. He returned from this encounter with a project that was almost impossibly ambitious, and that he pursued for the rest of his life with extraordinary single-mindedness: the complete translation of Aristotle and Plato into Latin, accompanied by commentaries that would make the philosophical substance of their work genuinely available to readers who could not access the originals. The political context within which he pursued this intellectual project was the kingdom of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who had conquered Italy in 493 CE, and who ruled it as a king rather than an emperor, but with considerable political skill and a genuine appreciation for Roman culture and Roman administrative traditions. Theodoric needed Roman aristocrats with genuine competence in the traditions of Roman government to staff his administration, and Boethius was exactly the kind of figure he needed. Brilliantly educated, of impeccable aristocratic lineage, clearly capable, and apparently willing to serve the new political reality. The collaboration was genuinely productive for both parties for many years. Theodoric got the administrative and ceremonial expertise that gave his court a Roman character and Roman legitimacy. Boethius got the political security and the leisure to pursue his philosophical program, which he continued throughout the years of his official career with a productivity that is extraordinary, even by the standards of ancient polymaths. The peak of his public career came in 522 CE, when both his sons were appointed consuls simultaneously, an honour that his consolation describes with genuine pride as the peak of fortune's favour, a moment at which everything seemed to have aligned perfectly. He himself held the position of Master of Offices under Theodoric, the most powerful administrative position in the kingdom, responsible for overseeing the entire apparatus of royal government. He was at once the most learned man in the Latin West and one of its most powerful political figures, a combination that must have seemed from inside it like the realization of the Platonic dream of the philosopher king. Then, with a suddenness that the consolation conveys with controlled but unmistakable shock, everything collapsed. He was accused of treason, of corresponding with the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople in a manner that constituted conspiracy against Theodoric's rule. He was also accused, more specifically, of practicing magic to facilitate this treason, a charge whose meaning in the late antique context combined political conspiracy with something closer to the modern category of espionage. Whether the charges were true, partially true, or entirely fabricated is a question that historians have debated for 15 centuries without reaching a definitive conclusion. What is beyond dispute is that Boethius was arrested, stripped of his offices and property, imprisoned in Pavia, tried in his absence by a senate that had once honoured him and now condemned him, and executed, probably in 524 CE, at the order of the king he had served. The fall was total. Everything that the highest position in the most prestigious tradition of the ancient world had given him was taken away. The library, the office, the family connection, the public honour, the wealth, the freedom. All of it gone in the space of months. And in the prison at Pavia, in the time between his condemnation and his execution, he wrote the Consolation of Philosophy. He did not write it as a monument to self-pity or as a cry of protest against an unjust fate, though the injustice is acknowledged. He wrote it as a philosophical exercise in the most demanding sense, an attempt to think through, with full rigour and full honesty, what his situation actually was, what the things he had lost actually were, and what, if anything, remained that fortune had no power over. The result is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of human thought, a work that belongs to no single tradition, that is simultaneously Platonic and Aristotelian and Stoic and Christian, that draws on every resource of ancient philosophy to address the most pressing of all practical questions. What do you do when everything falls apart? Part 2. The intellectual formation, Athens, Aristotle, and the project of transmission. To understand Boethius's philosophy, you must understand the extraordinary scope and the extraordinary urgency of his intellectual project, because the project was not merely academic in any conventional sense. It was a rescue operation, a systematic attempt to preserve in Latin the philosophical heritage of Greece, at a moment when the conditions that had made that heritage accessible were being rapidly and irreversibly destroyed. Understanding what he was trying to do and why is essential for understanding both the consolation and the broader philosophical significance of his life's work. The situation of philosophical knowledge in the Latin West at the end of the 5th century was genuinely precarious in a way that is difficult to appreciate from our current vantage point, surrounded as we are by the vast accumulated libraries of the intervening centuries. Greek, which had been the language of philosophical discourse throughout the ancient world, was ceasing to be a living intellectual language in the West, with a speed that must have been alarming to anyone paying attention. The Platonic and Aristotelian texts that constituted the core of the philosophical tradition existed in their original Greek, supplemented by a rich tradition of Greek commentary and elaboration, but accessible in Latin only in fragmentary and inadequate translations. What Cicero and a handful of other Roman writers had provided was enough to give Latin readers a general sense of the Greek philosophical traditions, but nothing like the systematic and technically precise engagement with the texts that genuine philosophical work required. Boethius's response to this situation was characteristically both grand in its ambition and precise in its execution. He set himself the task of translating the complete works of Aristotle into Latin. Not loose paraphrases or simplified summaries, but accurate, technically careful translations that would make Aristotle's actual arguments available in Latin. He then planned to do the same for Plato, and beyond that to write commentaries on both that would demonstrate their fundamental agreement on the most important philosophical questions. The scope of this project was extraordinary. It would have constituted a complete philosophical library for the Latin reading world, and Boethius completed enough of it before his death to reshape the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe fundamentally, even though the project remained far from complete. What he actually accomplished was itself remarkable. Complete translations of Aristotle's logical works, the categories, the on-interpretation, the prior analytics, the topics, the sophistical refutations, accompanied by commentaries that preserved the Greek scholarly tradition of logical analysis in Latin form. He translated Porphyry's Isagoge, the standard introduction to Aristotle's categories that had been the gateway to philosophical study in the Greek schools, and wrote 2 commentaries on it. He wrote independent treatises on the topics in logic, on syllogisms, on the different kinds of argument. And he wrote the theological treatises, the Opuscula Sacra, that applied the logical and metaphysical tools of the philosophical tradition to the doctrinal questions of Christian theology, particularly the question of the Trinity, in a way that would make him one of the founding figures of what later centuries would call scholasticism. The philosophical method that emerges from this body of work is deeply significant for understanding the consolation. Boethius was above all a practitioner of what we might call philosophical precision, a thinker for whom the careful definition of terms, the precise articulation of distinctions, and the rigorous working out of implications were not merely technical requirements, but the actual substance of philosophical work. He had absorbed from the Greek logical tradition the conviction that philosophical errors were almost always, at their root, errors of definition and distinction, confusions about what terms meant, failures to distinguish things that needed to be distinguished, conflations of categories that philosophy existed to separate. And he applied this conviction not just to technical logical questions, but to the deepest questions of metaphysics and ethics. The project of reconciling Plato and Aristotle, which Boethius announced and partially pursued, was itself philosophically significant as a methodological commitment. The project assumed that the 2 greatest philosophers of antiquity were, despite their apparent disagreements, engaged in a common inquiry that pointed toward common conclusions, and that the apparent disagreements were products of different emphases or different terminological conventions, rather than irreconcilable philosophical differences. This assumption of fundamental philosophical harmony was itself a philosophical position, a position about the nature of philosophical truth and its relationship to the traditions that had investigated it. And it shaped Boethius's approach to every philosophical question he engaged with, including the questions of the consolation. He also absorbed from the Greek tradition a specific understanding of what philosophy was for, an understanding that went beyond the modern academic conception of philosophy as a discipline that analyzes arguments and clarifies concepts, to something more like the ancient understanding of philosophy as a way of life, a practice of the soul, a form of spiritual exercise designed to transform the practitioner's relationship to themselves and to the world. This understanding, which Pierre Hadot in the 20th century recovered and described so illuminatingly, is essential for reading the Consolation correctly. The Consolation is not a theoretical treatise about the problem of evil or the nature of providence. It is a philosophical therapy, a systematic attempt to transform the patient's relationship to his situation through the disciplined application of philosophical argument. The philosophical form is inseparable from the therapeutic purpose. Part 3. The method, dialogue, personification, and philosophy as medicine. To understand Boethius's philosophy, you have to understand his method, and his method in the Consolation was a choice of extraordinary philosophical deliberateness. A choice that determined everything about how the work reads, what it can and cannot do, and what kind of philosophical authority it claims for its arguments. He did not write a philosophical treatise. He did not write a personal memoir or a letter of protest. He did not write a theological meditation or a prayer. He wrote a prosimetrum, a work combining prose and verse, in the form of a philosophical dialogue between a suffering prisoner and a personified figure of philosophy who appears in his cell to offer consolation. The choice of the dialogue form was not a literary convenience. It was a philosophical statement. The dialogue form, which Boethius inherited from Plato, is the natural form of philosophy understood as a practice of questioning rather than a body of doctrine, a form in which understanding is not delivered from outside to passive recipients, but constructed through the interaction of questioner and respondent, through the movement from confusion to clarity that genuine philosophical engagement produces. In the Consolation, the prisoner's questions and objections are not mere pretexts for Lady Philosophy's speeches. They are genuinely necessary. They represent the real philosophical confusions and the real emotional resistances that any person in this situation would experience. And the dialogue's movement is the movement from those confusions to the clarity that philosophical argument can provide, when it can provide it, and when it cannot provide it, to a different kind of understanding that accepts the limits of what argument alone can accomplish. The personification of philosophy as a woman, a towering, ageless woman whose robes are embroidered with the Greek letters P and theta, representing practical and theoretical philosophy, whose hem is torn from the violence of those who have attacked her, who speaks with the authority of long and intimate acquaintance with the prisoner, is itself a philosophical device of considerable sophistication. Philosophy is not presented as an external authority speaking from outside the prisoner's experience. She is presented as the prisoner's oldest and most intimate companion, someone he has known all his life, whose voice he should recognize because it is, in the deepest sense, the voice of his own best self, the voice of the philosophical formation that he has received, and that is now available to him as a resource precisely because he devoted his life to acquiring it. When Lady Philosophy comes to Boethius's cell, she is not bringing him something alien. She is reminding him of what he already knows, but has forgotten in the shock and grief of his situation. The alternation of prose and verse is also philosophically deliberate. The prose sections carry the main argumentative weight, the careful philosophical arguments about the nature of fortune, happiness, providence, and evil. The verse sections, the poems that punctuate the prose, do something different. They address not the intellect, but the imagination and the emotions, offering images and myths and lyrical meditations that prepare the emotional ground for the intellectual arguments, or that allow the intellect to rest and integrate what it has understood. The Consolation's method is a method of total engagement, engaging the whole person, not just their rational faculty, in the process of philosophical transformation. This total engagement is not a concession to the literary tastes of a Roman audience. It is a reflection of a sophisticated understanding of how philosophical change actually happens, in which emotional preparation is as necessary as intellectual argument, and in which the images that shape our emotional responses need to be transformed along with the beliefs that shape our intellectual ones. Lady Philosophy's opening diagnosis of the prisoner's condition is itself a philosophical argument of considerable subtlety. She does not begin by addressing the question of whether his condemnation was just. She begins by observing that the prisoner is in a state of confusion about who he is and what he needs, that he has confused himself with his circumstances, has taken his social identity for his real identity, has mistaken the goods that fortune gave him for the genuine goods that constitute a good human life. The therapy proceeds from this diagnosis, the argument that fortune has taken away only what fortune gave, that what fortune gave was never genuinely his, that his real identity and his genuine good were never at fortune's disposal in the first place. This is not a comfortable argument, and Boethius does not present it as such. It is a demanding argument that requires the prisoner to revise his most fundamental assumptions about what he is and what he needs. And it is an argument that philosophy insists he can follow, because he has spent his life developing precisely the intellectual and moral capacities that are required to follow it. The method also includes a crucial structural move that is easy to overlook, but philosophically essential: the sequence of the argument. Lady Philosophy does not begin with the highest philosophical truths and work downward to the prisoner's situation. She begins where the prisoner is, in grief, in shock, in the experience of injustice and loss, and works upward, step by step, from the immediate experience to the philosophical principles that can reframe it. This pedagogical sequence is not accidental. It reflects the conviction that genuine philosophical understanding is not a matter of being told the right answer, but of being led through an argument that one genuinely follows and genuinely tests to a position that one has arrived at oneself. The prisoner's resistance, his questions, his objections, his inability to accept conclusions that seem right intellectually but feel wrong emotionally, all of these are not obstacles to the philosophy. They are the philosophy, the evidence that the dialogue is working with real philosophical confusion rather than performing agreement with predetermined conclusions. Part 4. Fortune and her wheel. The central argument. At the heart of everything the Consolation argues lies a single, unsparing, philosophically rigorous confrontation with the concept of fortune, and with the human tendency to make fortune's gifts the basis of happiness. This is not an obscure technical argument. It is the master key to the entire philosophical project, the argument from which everything else follows, and to which everything else returns. Understanding it deeply, not just as an intellectual proposition, but as a live philosophical challenge to the way most people organize their lives, is the most important task in understanding Boethius. Fortune, in the Consolation, is personified as a figure who speaks directly to the prisoner in one of the most famous passages in medieval literature. A direct speech in which Fortune explains her own nature with a candour that is itself a form of philosophical instruction. "I turn the wheel that spins," she says. "I delight to see the high come down and the low ascend. Mount up, if you wish, but on condition that you do not think it a hard usage when the rule of my game requires your descent. Did you not know this is my art? This is the game I never cease to play. I turn the wheel that spins. I delight to see the high come down and the low ascend. This is my art. This is the game I never cease to play." The argument embedded in Fortune's speech is this: if you chose to play Fortune's game, If you accepted the goods she offered and organized your happiness around their possession, then you accepted, implicitly but fully, the terms of her game. And the terms of her game always include the possibility of reversal. Fortune never promises permanence. Fortune never conceals the fact that what she gives, she can take. The person who complains that fortune has treated them unjustly by taking away what she gave has misunderstood the fundamental nature of fortune's gifts. The complaint is like accepting a bet and then complaining when you lose. This is an argument that could easily be dismissed as cold comfort, a philosophical sophistication that amounts to telling the victim of injustice that it is their own fault for caring about what was taken from them. Boethius, through Lady Philosophy, is acutely aware of this danger and addresses it directly. The argument is not that loss is not painful. It is not that the prisoner should not feel grief. It is not that injustice is not real, or that the specific injustice done to him was not a genuine moral outrage. The argument is about something more fundamental. It is about what kind of thing fortune's goods actually are, about whether they were ever genuinely the basis of a stable and genuine happiness, about whether the human tendency to organize one's deepest sense of self and well-being around things that fortune controls is a rational strategy or a fundamental error. The philosophical core of the argument is a distinction between two kinds of good. Goods that are genuinely good, goods that constitute genuine happiness, that cannot be taken from the person who has them, that are the actual object of the human desire for happiness, and goods that merely appear to be good, that provide a simulacrum of happiness when fortune is favourable and reveal their inadequacy when fortune turns. Fortune's gifts, wealth, power, political office, public honour, physical health, belong to the second category. They are not nothing. They can provide genuine conveniences, genuine pleasures, genuine opportunities. But they are not the genuine good that all human beings are, underneath their confused desires, actually pursuing. They are images of the good, reflections of a genuine good that they cannot themselves provide, and the person who mistakes the image for the reality is not just philosophically mistaken. They are investing their deepest sense of well-being in something structurally incapable of supporting it. Lady Philosophy develops this argument through a systematic examination of each of the things that fortune provides, showing in each case how the thing fails to provide what the human desire for happiness is actually seeking. Wealth, she argues, cannot make a person genuinely self-sufficient, because the possession of wealth generates the need for its protection, creates anxiety about its loss, and makes the wealthy person dependent on the continued cooperation of those who might take it. Power and political office cannot provide genuine dignity, because genuine dignity is a quality of character that neither office nor its loss can create or destroy. The wicked person in office has no genuine dignity, and the good person stripped of office has lost nothing that made them good. Fame and public honour cannot constitute happiness, because fame is the opinion of others, which is both unstable and logically incapable of providing the inner completeness that happiness requires. Even physical health and beauty, the gifts of fortune most intimately connected with the body rather than the social world, are inadequate because they are contingent and temporary in a way that genuine happiness cannot be. The pattern that emerges from this survey is philosophically precise. Each of the goods fortune provides is inadequate as a basis for genuine happiness, not because of some contingent defect in this or that particular case of wealth or power, but because of a structural feature common to all of them. They are all external. They are all contingent. They are all capable of being lost. And genuine happiness, the happiness that all human beings actually desire when they pursue any particular good, must be something that, once genuinely possessed, cannot be lost, because genuine happiness is not a condition created by the presence of particular external goods, but a condition of the person themselves. The person who genuinely possesses the good has it not because external circumstances are favourable, but because of what they are, because of their character, their understanding, their orientation toward reality. And this kind of possession cannot be taken by fortune, because it is not in fortune's gift. This is the argument for what philosophy calls the true good, the genuine good that is the real object of the human desire for happiness, and that is located not in the external goods fortune distributes, but in something internal, something the person has or has not, by virtue of what they are, rather than by virtue of what they possess. The true good is self-sufficiency, not the self-sufficiency of Diogenes, which was achieved through radical material reduction, but the self-sufficiency of the soul that has understood what genuine happiness is and has oriented itself toward it. The true good is the condition of the person who has found in themselves, in reason, in virtue, in the orientation of the will toward what is genuinely good, a source of well-being that fortune's wheel cannot disturb. Part 5. The true good, happiness, God, and the sufficiency of virtue. The positive content of the Consolations philosophy, what it is for, not just what it is against, can be captured in the argument for what Lady Philosophy calls the true good, the bonum verum, the genuine happiness that is the real object of human desire beneath all its confused and misdirected manifestations. This argument is not simply the negative claim that fortune's goods are inadequate. It is a positive philosophical account of what genuine happiness is, where it is located, and what relationship it has to the God that the Consolation places at the apex of its philosophical vision. The argument proceeds from a fundamental observation about human desire, that all human beings in everything they do are pursuing something they call happiness, a state of complete sufficiency, of genuine well-being, of having everything they need and needing nothing further. The specific things they pursue differ enormously: wealth, power, pleasure, honour, knowledge. But the desire behind those specific pursuits is always the same desire. The desire for a condition of genuine completeness that will end the striving, that will satisfy rather than merely temporarily quiet the longing that drives human behaviour. This observation is not a moral prescription. It is an empirical claim about the structure of human motivation, that beneath the extraordinary diversity of what human beings pursue, there is a single underlying desire that all those pursuits are attempting, in different and typically confused ways, to satisfy. Lady Philosophy's argument is that this desire, the desire for genuine completeness and genuine sufficiency, is not a fantasy or a pathological longing. It is a real desire for a real good that genuinely exists. The desire is the trace in human psychology of a genuine good that the soul is oriented toward, even when it cannot articulate what it is, and pursues confused simulacra in its place. And the genuine good that the desire is tracking, the genuine happiness that would actually satisfy the deepest human longing, is God. Not a personal God who rewards the virtuous and punishes the wicked in a simple moral economy, but the supreme good, the source of all being and all goodness, the ultimate reality that everything else participates in to the degree that it has been at all. God is the genuine happiness that all human beings are pursuing without knowing it, the object of the universal desire for completeness that drives the whole of human life. This identification of genuine happiness with God is philosophically demanding and requires careful handling. It is not simply the religious claim that happiness is found in the love of God, made more philosophical by being attached to a Neo-Platonic metaphysics. It is a specific philosophical argument about the structure of the good and the nature of genuine happiness. The argument is that the genuine good, the complete and self-sufficient good that would actually satisfy the desire for completeness, must be one, unified, and supreme. It cannot be a collection of partial goods, because a collection of partial goods could always be improved by the addition of something further, and therefore would not be truly complete. It must be identical with being at its highest degree, because anything less than the highest degree of being is susceptible to loss and therefore cannot be genuinely self-sufficient. And this perfect, unified, complete, supremely real good is what the philosophical tradition calls God. The implications of this identification are worked out with considerable philosophical care. If genuine happiness is identical with God, and if God is the supreme good in which all things participate to the degree of their reality, then the pursuit of genuine happiness is not something separate from or opposed to the pursuit of the good as such. All things, insofar as they have being and goodness, are participating in the supreme good, and in this sense are pursuing happiness in their own way and to the degree of their capacity. Even apparently wicked or disordered things, to the extent that they have being at all, are participating in goodness, and are therefore, in the deepest sense, oriented toward the same ultimate good toward which everything else is oriented. The difference between the virtuous and the wicked is not that one is pursuing happiness and the other something else. It is that the virtuous person is pursuing genuine happiness by genuinely appropriate means, while the wicked person is pursuing the same happiness by means that are constitutively incapable of providing it. This has important consequences for the question of whether the virtuous are ever genuinely harmed by fortune's reversals. If genuine happiness consists in the orientation of the will toward the true good, in virtue, in the correct understanding of what is genuinely worth pursuing, then the person who possesses genuine virtue cannot be deprived of genuine happiness by any external reversal. What fortune takes is what fortune gives, the external goods that are not genuine goods. The internal goods, the virtuous character, the correct orientation of the will, the philosophical understanding that constitutes genuine wisdom. These are not in fortune's power. The prisoner in his cell, if he genuinely possesses the wisdom and virtue that he has spent his life cultivating, has not lost what genuinely mattered. He has lost what appeared to matter from within the confused framework of fortune's game, which he has now been given, at enormous cost, the opportunity to see clearly. This is not a comforting argument in any easy sense. It does not deny the reality of the suffering. It does not pretend that the injustice is not an injustice. It insists with full philosophical seriousness that the person who has genuinely understood the argument should be able to find in the very completeness of the reversal a confirmation of the philosophical insight that genuine happiness was never located in the things that were taken. And it insists that this insight, genuinely achieved, is itself the highest form of happiness available to a human being. Not a consolation prize, but the actual prize, the recognition of what was genuinely real and genuinely good in a life that had been organized, at its best moments, around the pursuit of genuine wisdom. Part 6. Providence and Fate. Why bad things happen to good people. The aspect of the Consolations philosophy that most directly engages with the deepest anxieties of its reader, and of every reader who has encountered it since, is its treatment of the apparent injustice of fortune, the perennial, painful, and philosophically urgent question of why the good suffer and the wicked prosper, of why the universe appears to be indifferent to moral desert, of how to reconcile the apparent disorder of human experience with any conception of a universe governed by reason and justice. This is not an abstract problem for Boethius. It is the specific situation in which he writes. He is a man who by every reasonable account lived virtuously, served the public good, sought justice, opposed corruption, and who is now awaiting execution on charges he denies, and that appear to many of his contemporaries to be fabricated. The question of why this is happening, of what relationship, if any, it has to any rational and just order, is not a puzzle he is addressing for intellectual recreation. It is the question that determines whether his situation has any meaning at all, or whether it is simply a random catastrophe in an indifferent universe. Lady Philosophy's response to this question is one of the most philosophically sophisticated attempts in the entire tradition to address the problem of evil and the problem of providence simultaneously. It distinguishes first between providence and fate, between the divine plan as it exists in the eternal mind of God and the unfolding of that plan in the temporal sequence of events that we experience as history. Providence is the view from eternity, the complete and simultaneous apprehension by the divine intelligence of everything that is and was and will be, seen not as a temporal sequence but as a unified whole. Fate is the expression of that eternal plan in temporal form, the same rational order as it appears, to beings embedded in time who experience events sequentially and therefore cannot see the whole to which each individual event belongs. The argument that follows from this distinction is philosophically demanding, but philosophically important. What appears from within the temporal sequence to be disordered and unjust may be perfectly ordered, and just from the perspective of the eternal whole. The suffering of the good and the prosperity of the wicked, which from within our temporal and partial perspective looks like evidence against the rationality of the universe, may, from the perspective of complete knowledge, be expressions of a justice more subtle and more comprehensive than any that limited human reason can directly perceive. This is not an invitation to passive acceptance of injustice or a denial that injustice is real. It is a philosophical argument about the epistemological limits of the perspective from which we make judgments about what is just and what is disordered. Lady Philosophy develops this argument with considerable care, acknowledging its emotional difficulty and its intellectual demands. She argues that even the apparently straightforward cases, the prosperity of the wicked, the suffering of the good, may be expressions of a providential order rather than violations of it. The good may be tested and strengthened by adversity in ways that their comfortable prosperity would never have produced. The wicked may be permitted their prosperity by a providence that knows that their punishment will be more effective when it comes after a longer period of false security, or that their prosperity is itself a form of punishment, a perpetuation of the condition of vice that is, in the deepest sense, its own punishment. These arguments are not presented as conclusive demonstrations that everything is, in fact, for the best. They are presented as illustrations of the principle that the divine perspective encompasses a complexity and a completeness that human reason cannot fully access, and that intellectual humility in the face of this complexity is a philosophical virtue rather than a philosophical failure. The argument about the punishment of the wicked is particularly philosophically interesting. Lady Philosophy argues that the wicked are, in a precise philosophical sense, always punished, not necessarily by external consequences, but by the condition of wickedness itself. The wicked person, by being wicked, has deprived themselves of genuine happiness, has oriented their will away from the true good, has chosen a condition of internal disorder that is its own punishment regardless of whether any external punishment follows. The person who has done wrong and gone unpunished by any external authority has not escaped punishment. They have simply added to the original wrong of their wickedness the further condition of being a person who does wrong and goes unpunished. A condition that, considered clearly, is worse than the condition of the person who has done wrong and been brought back to justice. This argument, that justice is always done because virtue is its own reward and vice its own punishment, is philosophically contentious, and Boethius knows it. But it represents an attempt to identify a form of cosmic justice that operates independently of the contingencies of fortune and the failures of human legal systems. Part 7. Eternity and Time. God's foreknowledge and human freedom. Among all the philosophical problems that the Consolation addresses, none is more technically demanding, more philosophically consequential, or more directly relevant to the prisoner's specific situation than the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. This is the problem that occupies the final and climactic book of the Consolation, and its treatment there is widely regarded as one of the most sophisticated attempts in the entire history of philosophy to reconcile two apparently incompatible claims: that God knows in advance everything that will happen, and that human beings are genuinely free to choose how they act. The incompatibility appears absolute. If God knows with certainty, before you make a choice, what choice you will make, then your choice seems to be determined. It had to be what God knew it would be, because God cannot be wrong. But if your choice was determined, in what sense was it? Free? And if your choices are not free, in what sense are you morally responsible for them? The problem is not a minor technical puzzle. It goes to the heart of the entire moral and religious framework within which the Consolation is working. If human freedom is illusory, then the distinction between virtue and vice collapses, and with it, the entire structure of philosophical ethics. If divine foreknowledge is false or limited, then the conception of God as omniscient and omnipotent, which is essential to the Consolation's account of providence, is undermined. Lady philosophy's solution to this problem is the doctrine of eternity, specifically the claim that God does not foreknow events in the temporal sense at all, because God does not exist in time. God's mode of existence is not temporal, not a sequence of past, present, and future, but eternal, a simultaneous and complete possession of all existence, a single infinite present that encompasses everything that was, is, and will be, not as a temporal sequence, but as a unified, simultaneous whole. God's knowledge of events that are, from our perspective, future is not foreknowledge in any sense that implies temporal priority. It is rather the knowledge of an eternal present that includes, in its simultaneous completeness, everything that temporal beings experience sequentially. The philosophical significance of this distinction is considerable. If God's knowledge of what we call future events is not temporally prior to those events, but is the eternal knowing of a present that encompasses them, then the knowledge does not impose necessity on the events in the way that ordinary foreknowledge would. When you watch a chariot race, your knowledge of what the chariots are doing does not cause or determine what they are doing. The necessity, if there is one, runs in the opposite direction. The chariot's movement is what determines your knowledge, not the other way around. Similarly, God's eternal knowledge of what we will do is not the cause of what we will do. It is the eternal apprehension of what we, in our temporal freedom, actually do. The freedom of human action and the completeness of divine knowledge are not in competition because they operate in different modes of existence, one temporal and contingent, the other eternal and complete. This is a philosophically sophisticated solution that raises its own questions, particularly questions about the coherence of the concept of an eternal mode of existence and about how an eternal apprehension of temporal events can be distinguished from simple, timeless necessity. These questions have occupied philosophers and theologians for the 15 centuries since Boethius articulated the solution. What makes the solution philosophically important, regardless of whether it is ultimately successful, is that it reframes the problem in a way that opens up genuinely new philosophical space, that shows that the apparent conflict between divine foreknowledge and human freedom rests on an assumption about the nature of God's existence that is not inevitable, and that, when examined carefully, may be incoherent. The assumption is that God is a temporal being who knows events before they happen. The alternative is that God is an eternal being for whom the temporal distinction between before and after simply does not apply. If the alternative is coherent, and Boethius argues at length that it is, then the conflict dissolves. The practical philosophical significance of this solution for the prisoner is also worth noting. If God's knowledge of events is not foreknowledge but eternal knowledge, then the events of the prisoner's life, including the injustice of his condemnation, the apparent triumph of his accusers, the suffering that awaits him, are not simply determined consequences of a predetermined plan that could not have been otherwise. They are events that occur within a framework of genuine human freedom, genuine moral agency, and genuine moral responsibility, and that are seen in their complete significance by a divine knowledge that encompasses their full context and their full consequences in a way that no temporal perspective can achieve. The prisoner's suffering is not meaningless. It is not the random product of an indifferent universe. It is an event within a story that has a significance that cannot be fully seen from within the temporal perspective of any individual participant, including the person who suffers it. Part 8. The Encounter with Power. Boethius and Theodoric. No episode in the life of Boethius crystallizes the philosophical content of his work more perfectly, or with more tragic economy, than the relationship between the philosopher and the king that ended in his execution. The encounter between Boethius and Theodoric is not merely a biographical fact about a philosopher who served a Gothic ruler and was executed by him. It is a philosophical parable about the relationship between wisdom and power, about what happens when the philosophical commitment to truth and justice encounters the political logic of a ruler who feels threatened, about what the philosopher owes to the community and what the community owes to the philosopher. Theodoric the Ostrogoth was, by the standards of his time and the standards of most times, a remarkably successful ruler. He had conquered Italy through a combination of military genius and political skill. He had governed it for decades with an effectiveness that even his Roman subjects, who had every reason to resent Gothic rule, were forced to acknowledge. He maintained the institutions of Roman administration, respected Roman law, tolerated the religious differences between his Arian Christian followers and the Orthodox Christian Romans he governed, and presided over a period of relative peace and stability in a world that was convulsed by constant warfare. He was, in the language of the time, a good barbarian, a ruler from outside the Roman tradition who had absorbed enough of that tradition to govern within it, rather than simply despoiling it. Boethius's service to Theodoric was genuine and productive. The philosophical project he pursued throughout his official career was made possible by the political security that Theodoric's patronage provided. The position of Master of Offices that he held was not an honorary position or a comfortable sinecure. It involved the actual administration of the kingdom, the management of the complex machinery of late Roman government that Theodoric had inherited and maintained. Boethius brought to this role the same qualities he brought to his philosophical work: precision, seriousness, a commitment to doing things correctly rather than merely conveniently, and a willingness to resist corruption, even when resistance made enemies. It was this last quality, the willingness to resist corruption even at personal cost, that appears to have contributed to the accusation that destroyed him. The specific charge was that he had defended a senator named Albinus from the accusation of treason, and had done so in a way that amounted to his own treason. Whether the charge was true, whether Albinus's correspondence with Constantinople was genuinely treasonous, whether Boethius's defense of him was politically naive rather than philosophically principled, all of these questions are genuinely uncertain. What seems clear is that the defense of Albinus put Boethius in conflict with political forces at Theodoric's court that were both powerful and hostile to the senatorial aristocracy, and that those forces found in the situation an opportunity to destroy a figure who had accumulated enough power, prestige, and moral authority to be genuinely threatening. the Consolations account of Boethius's own attitude toward his, consistent with the philosophical understanding of what genuine happiness requires. Lady Philosophy does not simply vindicate the choice. She argues something more nuanced, that the choice to enter public life in service of the good was genuinely virtuous, that the specific goods Boethius sought to achieve were genuine goods rather than mere fortune's gifts, and that the failure, the defeat of his efforts by the combination of political hostility and royal fear, does not retrospectively refute the philosophical principle that motivated the effort. Virtue is not guaranteed success. The philosophical person who acts virtuously and suffers unjust punishment has not made a philosophical error. They have demonstrated at the highest possible cost the truth of the philosophical principle that virtue and genuine happiness are not dependent on fortune's favour. Demonstrated it not as an argument, but as a life. Part 9. The Question of Evil. Why the wicked appear to prosper. One of the most important and most philosophically sophisticated aspects of the Consolations' treatment of providence is its engagement with what has always seemed the most powerful objection to any rational and just ordering of the universe. Not merely that the good suffer, but that the wicked prosper. Good suffering might be explained by appeal to the educational or purifying function of adversity. But the wicked prospering, the corrupt political operator who framed an innocent man sitting in comfortable security while the innocent man awaits execution, seems to defy not just emotional acceptance, but rational explanation. Boethius, through Lady Philosophy, does not avoid this challenge. He confronts it directly, and the argument he develops in response is one of the most philosophically interesting and most philosophically demanding in the entire Consolation. The argument proceeds in several stages, each of which represents a genuine philosophical position rather than a mere rhetorical move, and each of which requires genuine engagement rather than simple assent. The first stage is a reframing of what it means for the wicked to prosper. Lady Philosophy argues that what appears to be prosperity for the wicked is, on closer examination, not genuine prosperity at all. A person is genuinely prosperous in the relevant philosophical sense when they have what genuinely constitutes the good, when they are in possession of genuine happiness. And the wicked, precisely because they are wicked, have oriented themselves away from the genuine good. They have substituted the image of the good, the external goods that fortune distributes, for the genuine good itself. Their apparent prosperity is the accumulation of these substitutes, which provides something that resembles happiness from a distance, but is, on examination, a condition of fundamental deprivation, the deprivation of genuine happiness in exchange for its simulacrum. The wicked who seem to prosper are, in the most precise philosophical sense, failures. People who have failed at the one enterprise that matters, the enterprise of living well, regardless of how successfully they have pursued the enterprises that fortune rewards. The second stage addresses the question of power. Lady Philosophy argues, in a move that has deep roots in the Platonic tradition, that the wicked are in a genuine sense powerless, that real power, the power to achieve what one genuinely wills, is not available to the person whose will is disordered, because the disordered will is always undermining its own deepest purposes. The wicked person who wants genuine happiness but pursues it through the wrong means, through wealth, through political domination, through the defeat of their opponents, is a person whose power is constitutively inadequate to their actual purpose. They can accumulate the goods that fortune distributes. They cannot, through those goods, achieve the genuine happiness that is their deepest desire. In this sense, the apparently powerful wicked are in fact deeply impotent, capable of external action, but incapable of genuine self-fulfillment. The third stage is the most challenging and the most philosophically interesting. The argument that the wicked are always, in a comprehensive sense, punished, not necessarily by the external consequences of their wickedness, which fortune may or may not arrange, but by the wickedness itself. This argument draws on the Platonic identification of virtue with health of the soul and vice with disease of the soul. A wicked person is, in this conception, a sick person, a person whose soul is in a state of disorder and dysfunction that is the precise analogue of physical disease. And disease is its own punishment, regardless of whether any external agent imposes additional suffering. The person who is severely ill is suffering whether or not anyone has explicitly punished them for contracting the illness. Similarly, the wicked person is suffering, in the sense of being deprived of the genuine good, of living in a condition of fundamental disorder and dysfunction, whether or not any external punishment has been imposed. The apparent prosperity of the wicked is, in this view, a prosperity of the body and of fortune's gifts only. At the level that matters, the level of the soul's condition, and therefore of genuine happiness, the wicked are in a state of poverty and disease that no external prosperity can alleviate. These three moves, reframing prosperity, reframing power, and identifying wickedness with its own punishment, constitute a philosophical response to the problem of the prospering wicked that is genuinely sophisticated, even if it is not emotionally satisfying in any simple sense. The philosophical work requires genuine engagement and genuine intellectual humility about the limits of the temporal perspective from which all of us, including the prisoner awaiting execution, assess what is actually happening and why. What the consolation asks for is not naive optimism or forced acceptance. It asks for the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that the temporal and partial perspective from which fortune's distribution appears unjust is not the only perspective available, and that the perspective of genuine philosophical understanding, which is as close as finite human minds can come to the divine perspective, provides resources for a different assessment that is not simply wishful thinking, but a product of careful argument. Part 10. Boethius and Women. Wisdom, personified and the limits of the text. Any serious engagement with Boethius must address the most striking and most philosophically interesting gender-related feature of his work: the choice to personify philosophy as a woman, to make the voice of supreme philosophical wisdom female, and to present the entire drama of philosophical consolation as a dialogue between a grieving male prisoner and a female teacher. This choice is philosophically significant in ways that go far beyond its immediate narrative function, and examining it honestly requires holding together the genuinely progressive implications of the personification and the genuine limitations of the social and intellectual world within which Boethius operated. The personification of Lady Philosophy as a woman in the Consolation is, in the context of late Roman and early medieval culture, a remarkable philosophical gesture. Philosophy is not merely female in the sense of using the feminine grammatical gender that the Latin word philosophia requires. She is actively, characteristically, and powerfully female. She is described with extraordinary presence and authority. She speaks with complete command of every philosophical tradition. She moves between the most technically demanding logical argument and the most emotionally penetrating lyrical expression with effortless competence. And she occupies throughout the work the position of the teacher whose intellectual and moral authority over the prisoner is absolute and unquestioned. In a world in which women were systematically excluded from the philosophical schools, from positions of public intellectual authority, and from the kind of engagement with the Greek philosophical tradition that Boethius devoted his life to. In this world, the figure of Lady Philosophy as the supreme representative of that tradition is a philosophical statement of considerable boldness. The philosophical rationale for the female personification is, in part, traditional. Philosophy had been personified as female in earlier texts, drawing on the ancient association between wisdom and the feminine in Greek culture, an association most visible in the figure of Sophia and in the goddess Athena, patroness of wisdom and rational arts. But Boethius does something with this tradition that goes beyond mere convention. He makes Lady Philosophy not merely an allegorical figure representing an abstract concept, but a vivid, powerful, intellectually commanding presence, whose female identity is integral to her characterization. She is not a generic wise person who happens to be grammatically feminine. She is a specific kind of wisdom. A wisdom that combines the rigor of logical argument with the warmth of genuine care for the prisoner, that holds together intellectual authority and personal intimacy, that speaks from a position of ancient and continuous relationship with the person she is consoling rather than from the detached objectivity of a neutral expert. These are, in the gender coding of Boethius's culture, distinctively female qualities, and the personification of philosophy with these qualities is a philosophical claim about what philosophical wisdom actually is. The philosophical claim implicit in this female personification is important. It is a claim that genuine wisdom is not cold, detached, or purely cerebral, that it is not the property of the kind of hard masculine reason that the Stoic traditions sometimes embodied. Genuine wisdom, as Lady Philosophy embodies it, is warm and caring as well as rigorous and precise, intimate as well as impersonal, personally committed to the well-being of the person it addresses, as well as devoted to the truth of the arguments it makes. This is a richer and more complete picture of philosophical wisdom than a purely masculine personification would have produced, and it reflects something important about what the consolation itself is doing. It is not presenting cold, logical arguments designed to force assent, but engaged philosophical therapy designed to help a suffering person transform their relationship to their situation. At the same time, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the limits of this progressive gesture. The consolation does not address the actual situation of women in late Roman society or advocate for their inclusion in the philosophical tradition. The female personification of philosophy does not translate into any practical argument about the philosophical capacities or the intellectual entitlements of actual women. Lady Philosophy is a literary and philosophical device, a way of personifying wisdom in a manner that serves specific literary and philosophical purposes, and she exists entirely in the realm of philosophical allegory rather than in the realm of social reality. The actual women of Boethius's world, including his wife Rusticiana and his mother-in-law Heloise, who are mentioned with genuine affection in the Consolation, remain in the background, unnamed or named only as the objects of tender concern, rather than as philosophical interlocutors in their own right. What the female personification of philosophy demonstrates, in the end, is the same phenomenon that the examination of gender in the Cynic and Hobbesian traditions demonstrates: the gap between the radical implications of philosophical principles and the constraints of social context. The Consolation's philosophical vision, in which what genuinely matters is the quality of the soul and its orientation toward the true good, in which external circumstances, including social position, are precisely the things that fortune distributes, and that genuine wisdom transcends, has implications for the social position of women that Boethius does not pursue. The same philosophical framework that dissolves the prisoner's attachment to his political office and his public honour should, if applied consistently, dissolve the philosophical relevance of the distinction between male and female. That this implication is not pursued reflects the power of social context to constrain even the most philosophically sophisticated imagination. Part 11. Death and Transcendence. The philosopher's final lesson. Boethius's attitude toward his own approaching death is, in the Consolation, the deepest and most philosophically consequential application of every argument the work has made. He does not merely argue abstractly about the philosophical attitude toward mortality. He enacts that attitude, or attempts to enact it, and is honest about the difficulty. In a situation where the argument must be lived rather than merely held, where the gap between knowing the right philosophical response and actually achieving it is maximally visible. The philosophical problem of death that the Consolation engages with is different in its specific shape from the problem that Diogenes addressed. Diogenes' philosophical response to death was rooted in the Epicurean argument that death is the cessation of experience and therefore nothing to the person who dies, that the fear of death is generated by a philosophical error, by the confusion of non-existence with a bad form of existence. Boethius's philosophical response is rooted in a different tradition. The Platonic argument that the soul is distinct from the body and survives its death, that the death of the body is not the death of the person, but a separation of the soul from its temporary embodiment, and that the person who has genuinely understood the soul's nature and its relationship to the true good will face the death of the body not with equanimity simply, but with something approaching philosophical eagerness. The eagerness of the Platonic philosopher to be liberated from the distractions of embodiment and to return to the pure contemplation of what is genuinely real. But the Consolation's treatment of death is more nuanced and more honest than a simple application of Platonic immortality arguments would suggest. Lady Philosophy does not simply assert the immortality of the soul and invite the prisoner to take comfort from it. She argues for a specific philosophical orientation toward death that does not depend on certainty about the soul's afterlife, but on clarity about the soul's relationship to genuine happiness in this life. Even setting aside the question of whether the soul survives death, the person who has genuinely understood what genuine happiness is, who has genuinely recognized that it consists in the orientation of the soul toward the true good, rather than in the possession of fortune's gifts, should be able to face the death of the body without the kind of desperate fear that the prospect of losing everything inspires in those who have located their happiness in external goods. Death takes only what death can take. And what death can take, the body, the social position, the accumulated possessions and relationships, is exactly what the philosopher has recognized through the philosophical work of the Consolation, as never genuinely theirs in the most important sense. The Consolation does not describe Boethius's actual death. It ends before that event, with Lady Philosophy's great argument about eternity and divine knowledge, and with a final passage that turns from the philosophical arguments back to the question of how to live, how to act, how to pray, how to treat other human beings, in the light of the understanding that the arguments have produced. This ending is itself philosophically significant. The Consolation does not end with the prisoner peacefully accepting his death as a merely external event of no philosophical significance. It ends with a turn toward practical wisdom, toward the question of how to live in the time that remains, with the clarity that philosophy has produced. This is the Boethian version of the philosophical courage that the great traditions demand. Not the flamboyant shamelessness of Diogenes, not the geometric boldness of Hobbes, but the quiet, precise, unflinching application of philosophical understanding to the situation that is actually present, however terrible that situation is. The actual manner of Boethius's death, he was executed, probably by being clubbed to death or garroted, was violent and without the serene theatrical quality that philosophical tradition often attributes to the deaths of philosophers. The gap between the philosophical ideal of the death of Socrates, composedly drinking hemlock and discussing the soul's immortality with his friends, and the brutal reality of Boethius's end, is not incidental. It is philosophically instructive in the way that all gaps between the ideal and the real are philosophically instructive. It reminds us that philosophy is worked out in conditions that resist its ideals, that the philosophical achievement is precisely the achievement of maintaining the orientation towards the true good in circumstances that make that orientation maximally difficult. The consolation that survives Boethius is the testimony that the orientation was maintained, that the work of philosophy continued to the end, that the arguments were followed wherever they led, regardless of the circumstances in which they were followed. That testimony is itself the most powerful argument the consolation makes. Part 12. The Transmission. From prison cell to medieval schoolroom, Boethius did not simply leave behind a philosophical text to be evaluated by later thinkers. He left behind a complete philosophical inheritance that shaped the intellectual life of Europe for 1,000 years, an inheritance that operated at multiple levels simultaneously, from the most technically demanding logical and theological analysis to the most broadly accessible meditation on fortune and happiness, and that was available in Latin to a world where Latin was the universal language of educated discourse, and Greek was, for most readers, inaccessible. The immediate posthumous fate of the Consolation was, given the circumstances of its composition, remarkable. A work written by a condemned prisoner in the last months before his execution, without the benefit of the author's revision or the normal processes of publication, survived the political and cultural upheavals of the late 6th century and found its way into the libraries and schoolrooms of the emerging medieval world. It was read by Gregory the Great, who shaped the intellectual character of early medieval Christianity. It was translated into Old English by Alfred the Great in the 9th century, who regarded the translation as a central part of his project for the cultural revival of Anglo-Saxon England, a revival that was, in its own way, a repetition of Boethius's original project of cultural transmission. It was translated into French by Jean de Meun in the 13th century, and into English by Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 14th, becoming one of the central texts of medieval literary culture in vernacular as well as in Latin. The range of writers who were influenced by the Consolation reads like a catalogue of medieval intellectual culture. Dante used it as a source for the Commedia, incorporating both its philosophical arguments and its poetic sensibility. Thomas Aquinas engaged with its theological arguments about providence and divine foreknowledge in ways that shaped the Thomistic synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy. Bede cited it. Alcuin drew on it. The entire tradition of fortune literature in medieval and Renaissance culture, the vast body of writing about the instability of worldly goods and the superiority of virtue to fortune, is descended from it. The figure of Fortune and her wheel, which became one of the most ubiquitous images in medieval literature and visual art, is Boethius's creation in its specifically philosophical form, the form that gave the image its philosophical weight and its moral authority. But the transmission was not only of the Consolation. Boethius's logical translations and commentaries, the works that made Aristotle's logical writings available in Latin, were arguably even more practically important for the shape of medieval intellectual life, because they provided the basic logical and philosophical vocabulary within which all serious medieval intellectual discourse operated. The debates of the schools about universals, about predication, about the nature of categories, about the relationship between faith and reason, were conducted in the conceptual framework that Boethius had provided, using distinctions and terminologies that he had introduced into Latin philosophical discourse. Without his translations and commentaries, the scholastic philosophy of the High Middle Ages, the great synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy that Thomas Aquinas and his contemporaries achieved, would not have been possible in anything like the form it took. The reception of his theological opuscula was equally significant. His application of logical and metaphysical analysis to the doctrinal questions of Christian theology, particularly his treatment of the Trinity in the Opuscula Sacra, established a model for theological reasoning that would be enormously influential. The approach of using philosophical categories to clarify and defend theological doctrine, of bringing the rigor of logical analysis to the language of Christian faith, was not invented by Boethius. Origen and Augustine had worked in this tradition before him, but he gave it a specifically Aristotelian logical form that proved extraordinarily productive. The tradition of scholastic theology that developed in the medieval universities and culminated in the Summa Theologiae of Aquinas is, in its logical methods and its philosophical vocabulary, deeply Boethian. Part 13. The Critics. What Boethius got wrong. No serious engagement with Boethius can avoid the serious criticisms his philosophy has attracted, because those criticisms are serious, because they point to genuine philosophical difficulties rather than mere disagreements of taste or emphasis, and because engaging with them is the best way to understand both the extraordinary achievement and the genuine limitations of the consolation. The most persistent and in some ways most fundamental criticism concerns the relationship between the consolation and Christianity. Boethius was a Christian who wrote theological treatises defending orthodox Christian doctrine, and yet the consolation, which he wrote while awaiting execution, presumably in the shadow of his own mortality, makes no explicit reference to Christ, no appeal to Christian revelation, no invocation of the specifically Christian consolations that one might expect from a man of his convictions in his situation. The work is a work of philosophical consolation in the tradition of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. And it is this, rather than any Christian revelation, that lady philosophy offers to the prisoner. The absence of specifically Christian content in a work written by a Christian in extremis has generated nearly 15 centuries of debate about what it means and whether it represents a philosophical failure, a religious failure, or a deliberate philosophical choice. The defenders of Boethius argue that the choice to write a purely philosophical rather than explicitly theological consolation was itself a philosophical statement, a demonstration that reason unaided by revelation can reach the most important truths about fortune, happiness, and the good life, and that the philosophical tradition of antiquity was not in competition with Christian revelation, but was pointing in its own way toward the same truths. This is a philosophically respectable position, and there is genuine evidence that Boethius understood his entire career, the project of translating and commenting on Aristotle, the project of reconciling Plato and Aristotle, the project of applying philosophical method to theological questions, as a project of demonstrating the compatibility and mutual illumination of reason and faith. The consolation on this reading is the philosophical complement to the theological treatises, the demonstration that reason, without the assistance of revelation, can reach the most important truths about the good life. The critics argue, however, that the absence of Christian content in the consolation is not a philosophical strength, but a philosophical and theological failure. If the Christian revelation is true, if Christ's resurrection is a historical event that transforms the meaning of suffering and death, then a consolation that addresses suffering and death without reference to that transformation is not complementary to Christian faith, but incomplete in a fundamental way. The consolation offers the prisoner the philosophical insight that genuine happiness consists in the orientation of the soul toward the true good, and it identifies the true good with a philosophical concept of God. But it does not offer the specifically Christian hope that the prisoner's suffering has a redemptive significance, that death is not an ending but a transformation, that the personal God of Christian faith is present in the situation in a way that purely philosophical reasoning cannot disclose. Whether the absence of this specifically Christian content is a philosophical choice that respects the integrity of purely rational argument, or a theological failure that leaves the consolation's consolation incomplete, is a question that 15 centuries of readers have answered in different ways. A related criticism concerns the adequacy of the consolation's treatment of evil and injustice. The philosophical arguments about providence, fate, and the ultimate punishment of the wicked are sophisticated and challenging, but they remain, at the level of the individual human person, embedded in specific historical circumstances of specific injustice, somewhat abstract. The prisoner who is awaiting execution for a crime he did not commit needs more than the philosophical insight that the wicked are, in a deep sense, always punished, and the good are, in a deep sense, never genuinely harmed. He needs something that addresses the specific concrete injustice of his specific situation, something that says not only that the universe is ultimately just, but that this particular injustice, in this particular case, matters and is seen and is not simply absorbed into a cosmic order that transcends the significance of individual human suffering. The consolation's philosophical framework tends to resolve individual suffering into the perspective of the cosmic whole in ways that can seem to make individual suffering philosophically invisible. This is not an objection that can be easily answered within the framework of the work's own philosophical commitments, because the commitment to the cosmic perspective, the divine view of the whole from which individual suffering appears in its true significance, is precisely what is supposed to provide consolation. But the gap between the cosmic perspective and the individual's experience of their own suffering is a gap that the philosophical arguments, however sophisticated, do not fully bridge, and acknowledging this gap is part of intellectual honesty about what the consolation achieves and what it does not. The argument about the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom, the most technically demanding philosophical contribution of the consolation, has also attracted sustained philosophical criticism. The solution depends on the coherence of the concept of divine eternity as a mode of existence that is genuinely different from both temporal duration and instantaneous present. Critics have argued that this concept is not fully coherent, that an eternal being who knows all events simultaneously is not clearly different from a temporal being who knows all events in advance, and that the freedom the solution is supposed to preserve is not actually preserved by the move to eternity. These are genuine philosophical objections that philosophers and theologians have been arguing about for 15 centuries, and they remain genuinely contested. What is clear is that the solution, even if not fully satisfactory, is philosophically serious. It represents a genuine attempt to identify the source of the apparent conflict and to show that the conflict depends on an assumption that can be questioned. Part 14. The influence on medieval literature, fortune, love, and the examined life. When the consolation moved from the philosophical schoolroom into the broader culture of medieval literature, it moved with a force and a pervasiveness that reshaped the entire imaginative landscape within which medieval writers and their audiences understood their own experience. The influence was not the diffuse background influence of a prestigious but rarely read classic. It was the direct and specific influence of a text that was read, studied, translated, cited, imitated and alloyed with every other major literary and philosophical tradition in ways that made it impossible to engage seriously with medieval literary culture without engaging with the consolation. Chaucer's engagement with Boethius was the most sustained and most productive of any vernacular medieval writer. He translated the consolation into English prose, a translation he called Bose, and the philosophical framework of the consolation permeates his entire poetic output in ways that range from explicit quotation to structural appropriation to deep thematic influence. Troilus and Cresside, his greatest poem, is a Boethian poem in its very structure. It is an extended meditation on the relationship between human desire, fortune, and the true good, dramatizing through the story of a great love that is destroyed by the turning of fortune's wheel, the philosophical argument that the consolation makes about the inadequacy of earthly goods as a basis for genuine happiness. The poem's ending, Troilus's ascent to the eighth sphere after his death, from which he looks down with philosophical laughter at the smallness of the earth and the futility of the desires that had consumed his life, is directly Boethian, a dramatic enactment of the philosophical perspective that lady philosophy attempts to awaken in the prisoner. Dante's engagement with Boethius in the Commedia is equally profound and equally direct. Boethius himself appears in the heaven of the sun in Paradiso, identified by Thomas Aquinas as the holy soul who unmasks the world's deceitfulness to anyone who listens carefully, an identification that signals Boethius's philosophical importance in Dante's vision. But beyond this direct appearance, the philosophical architecture of the Commedia owes an enormous debt to the Consolation, the conception of the divine as the source of all being and all good, the treatment of evil as privation rather than as a positive force, the understanding of hell as the ultimate consequence of the soul's misdirected will, the identification of genuine happiness with the contemplation of God. All of these draw directly and substantially on the philosophical framework of the Consolation. The figure of Fortune and her wheel, developed from a brief personification in the Consolation into one of the most ubiquitous and most philosophically loaded images in medieval culture, is Boethius's most visible influence on the literary imagination. The wheel appears in illuminated manuscripts, in cathedral decorations, in romance narratives, in moral tales, in political allegory, and in lyric poetry across the entire breadth of medieval Europe and the entire span of the medieval centuries. In every case, the image carries the philosophical freight that Boethius gave it, the reminder that the goods fortune gives are not genuinely ours, that the wheel that raises also lowers, that the wise person recognizes fortune's gifts for what they are and does not make them the foundation of a happiness they cannot support. The image was not merely decorative. It was philosophically instructive in the most direct way. A visual argument, available to the illiterate as well as the learned, that embodied the central insight of the Consolation in a form that required no text and no translation. The tradition of consolation literature that the Consolation generated was not merely a literary genre. It was a philosophical practice, a tradition of using the resources of philosophical argument and literary form to address the experience of adversity and loss in a way that was simultaneously intellectually rigorous and humanly responsive. Petrarch's Secretum, which is cast as a dialogue between Petrarch and St. Augustine, owes its form and its central philosophical concerns to Boethius. Erasmus's philosophical dialogues, More's Tower writings, Montaigne's essays, all of these engage with the Boethian tradition of philosophical consolation in ways that transform and extend it while acknowledging its authority. The philosophical practice of turning adversity into the occasion for philosophical reflection, of using the experience of loss and suffering as the occasion for the most rigorous examination of what genuinely matters, is a Boethian practice that has been continuously productive across 15 centuries of Western intellectual culture. Part 15. Boethius and Modernity, the philosopher who keeps returning. Boethius died in approximately 524 CE, nearly 1500 years ago, and he has not stayed dead in any philosophically meaningful sense. The Consolation keeps returning, in every era and in every cultural context that has produced people capable of confronting the fundamental contingency of human life, the radical exposure of everything we have built to the operations of forces beyond our control. The prisoner in Pavia asking what, in the midst of complete catastrophe, genuinely belongs to him, has proven to be one of the most renewable figures in the history of philosophy, precisely because the question he was asking, what genuinely matters when everything else has been taken, does not have a historical answer that settles it once and for all. The 20th century provided the Consolation with readers who understood its central question from the inside in ways that no amount of comfortable philosophical study could have produced. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience of Auschwitz, developed a psychological and philosophical framework for finding meaning in extreme suffering that has significant structural similarities to the Consolation's argument, even though Frankl's specific philosophical framework is existentialist rather than Platonic. The fundamental insight that the one thing that cannot be taken from a human being is their choice of how to respond to their situation, that genuine freedom and genuine dignity are interior realities that do not depend on external conditions, is a Boethian insight as much as it is an existentialist one. The experience of the concentration camps confirmed, in the most terrible possible way, the consolation's central claim, that genuine humanity is something that fortune cannot take, that the person who has cultivated genuine virtue and genuine philosophical clarity retains something that no political catastrophe can destroy. The contemporary relevance of the consolation's treatment of fortune extends in directions that Boethius could not have imagined, but that his philosophical framework can address. The experience of economic catastrophe, the sudden loss of financial security that modern economies periodically produce, is a specifically modern form of the fortune problem that the consolation addresses. The person who has organized their life around the accumulation of wealth and the security it seems to provide, and who finds that security shattered by forces entirely beyond their control, is in the situation of the consolation's prisoner at a lower level of social drama, but with the same philosophical urgency. The consolation's argument that the goods fortune distributes are not the genuine good, that the security that wealth appears to provide is always illusory, that genuine security consists in something that wealth cannot buy and poverty cannot take, is an argument with immediate practical resonance for anyone who has experienced the kind of reversal that exposes the contingency of economic security. The philosophical framework of the consolation has also found unexpected resonance in the contemporary psychological literature on resilience and meaning. Research on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon in which people who have survived extreme adversity report finding in the experience of adversity a clarity about what genuinely matters that ordinary, comfortable life had not provided, resonates with the consolation's argument that fortune's most devastating reversals can be, paradoxically, the most effective teachers about the genuine good. The person who has lost everything and found that they still exist, still think, still care about truth and about virtue and about genuine relationship. This person has discovered, through terrible experience, what Boethius discovered through philosophical argument and through the terrible experience of his own catastrophe. That the genuine good is not in the things that were lost, the problem of evil, of which the consolation's treatment of providential order and apparent injustice is one of the most sustained and most philosophically sophisticated ancient and medieval treatments, remains one of the central problems of contemporary philosophy of religion. Every contemporary philosopher who addresses the question of how to reconcile the existence of a good and omnipotent God with the existence of evil and suffering is engaging with a problem that Boethius addressed with philosophical seriousness, and the solutions he proposed, particularly the solution via divine eternity to the problem of foreknowledge and freedom, remain live philosophical options that contemporary philosophers take seriously and argue about vigorously. Part 16. The Complete Vision, Integration and Application. Boethius's philosophy, assembled from the prose and verse of the Consolation, from the logical translations and commentaries, from the theological opuscula, forms a coherent and demanding whole, whose central vision is of a universe ordered by a divine reason that encompasses everything, including the worst suffering, and a human soul whose highest good consists in its alignment with that divine order through the cultivation of genuine wisdom and genuine virtue. Its coherence is the coherence of a life organized by consistent philosophical principles rather than by the demands of fortune's game. A life that can face the most complete reversal of external fortune without losing its philosophical compass. The first and most fundamental application of Boethian philosophy to contemporary life is the practice of genuinely examining the relationship between external goods and genuine happiness, not accepting the conventional equation of wealth, status, power, and social recognition with the good life, not treating the accumulated goods of a successful conventional life as the measure of genuine flourishing, but honestly and rigorously asking, which of the things I am working to acquire and maintain are genuinely good in the sense that their possession constitutes genuine happiness? And which of them are fortune's gifts, things that provide genuine convenience and genuine pleasure, but are structurally incapable of constituting the genuine happiness that my deepest desire is seeking? This examination is uncomfortable because most of the things that contemporary culture treats as the marks of a successful life turn out, on Boethian analysis, to be fortune's gifts rather than genuine goods. But the discomfort of the examination is precisely the evidence that it is doing philosophical work. The second application is the Boethian practice of reframing adversity, not in the sense of finding a comfortable narrative that makes suffering feel better, but in the sense of using the experience of loss as the occasion for genuine philosophical inquiry into what genuinely matters. Boethius's situation was extreme, but the philosophical practice he exemplifies is available to anyone who is willing to engage with adversity philosophically rather than simply trying to overcome or escape it as quickly as possible. Every experience of loss is potentially an opportunity to test the assumption that the thing lost was genuinely necessary to genuine happiness, to discover whether its absence is as devastating as it seemed when the loss first occurred, and to identify in the experience of deprivation something that survives the deprivation, and that therefore cannot be among the things that fortune was distributing. This practice is not self-deception or forced cheerfulness. It is the rigorous application of philosophical inquiry to the raw material of experience. The third application is the Boethian understanding of virtue as the genuine good, as the actual content of genuine happiness, rather than merely a means to some further end. Contemporary culture tends to treat virtue in instrumental terms. We value honesty because it produces trust. We value justice because it makes cooperation possible. We value courage because it enables effective action. The Boethian tradition insists on a more demanding claim, that virtue is not merely instrumentally valuable, but intrinsically good, that the virtuous person has something of genuine worth, regardless of whether their virtue produces the external goods that instrumental reasoning would expect it to produce. The prisoner whose virtue has led to his unjust condemnation has not made a philosophical error. He has demonstrated at the highest possible cost what virtue actually is, something that does not depend for its value on the external consequences it produces. The fourth application is the specifically Boethian practice of philosophical patience in the face of apparent injustice. The willingness to withhold the immediate emotional judgment that the world is deeply disordered and unjust, and to consider instead whether the temporal and partial perspective from which that judgment is made is adequate to the complexity of what is actually happening. This is not a prescription for political passivity or for indifference to injustice. It is a philosophical discipline, the discipline of distinguishing between what can be seen from within the temporal sequence of events and what can only be seen from a perspective that encompasses the whole. The consolation does not tell the prisoner that the injustice done to him is not real. It tells him that the perspective from which the injustice appears as the final and definitive verdict on his situation is not the only perspective available, and that philosophical wisdom consists partly in the ability to maintain the broader perspective even when immediate experience makes it maximally difficult. The fifth application is the Boethian treatment of the relationship between philosophy and political engagement. The conviction that the philosophically formed person has an obligation to use their formation in service of the common good, even in the knowledge that the political world is not a hospitable place for philosophical principles, and that the philosopher who enters political life accepts the possibility of exactly the kind of catastrophic reversal that Boethius experienced. This is not a naive optimism about the political world. It is a philosophically grounded commitment to the view that the alternative, withdrawing into private philosophical life and leaving the political world to those without philosophical formation, is itself a philosophical failure, a refusal of the obligation that genuine wisdom creates. The consolation does not vindicate every choice Boethius made in his political career, but it does vindicate the philosophical principle that motivated those choices. The sixth application is the Boethian account of the relationship between human freedom and the providential order, the insistence that genuine human freedom and the rational governance of the universe are not in competition, but are compatible, that the freedom of human action is not undermined by the fact that it occurs within a framework that a divine reason comprehends in its entirety. The practical significance of this insight is not primarily theoretical. It is the difference between experiencing one's life as a series of random events in an indifferent universe and experiencing it as a set of genuinely free choices made within a framework that has meaning and direction, even when the meaning and direction are not visible from within the temporal sequence. This is not a comforting belief in a simplistic sense. The consolation is very clear that the providential order does not guarantee that the good will prosper, or that the wicked will be punished in any temporally visible way. But it is a belief that gives human action its significance and human suffering its dignity. The seventh and final application is the one that unifies all the others, the practice of intellectual honesty about what genuinely constitutes the good life, the willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads, to accept conclusions that are uncomfortable because they require revision of the most fundamental assumptions about what matters and what is worth pursuing, and to recognize in the most complete catastrophe not the refutation of the philosophical vision, but its confirmation. Boethius's lamp was not carried through the streets in search of honest men. It was held up to his own situation, in a prison cell, and used to examine with unflinching philosophical rigour what his situation actually was and what, in the most honest possible accounting, it revealed about what genuinely mattered. The examination did not make the situation better in any external sense. It made the examination possible. And the examination, the consolation that it produced, is the testimony that genuine philosophy can be practiced in the worst of circumstances, that the love of wisdom is not dependent on fortune's favour, and that the human mind, working with full rigour and full honesty, can find in the most complete adversity a clarity about the true good that comfortable prosperity never provides. Part 17. Boethius and the Scholastic Tradition. The philosopher who built the cathedral. Boethius died having completed by his own account only the first phase of an intellectual project of extraordinary scope and ambition. He had translated and commented on Aristotle's logical works. He had planned to translate all of Aristotle and all of Plato, and to demonstrate their fundamental agreement. He had barely begun. The execution that ended his life ended the project, leaving the medieval West with Aristotle's logic, but not his physics, his biology, his ethics, his politics, his metaphysics, all of which would have to be recovered through other channels centuries later. The loss is incalculable. And yet what Boethius accomplished in the time available to him, the transmission of Aristotelian logic, the demonstration that philosophical and theological reasoning could be combined in a mutually illuminating way, the consolation itself, proved to be exactly the right foundation for the intellectual tradition that developed in the centuries after his death. The scholastic philosophy of the High Middle Ages, the philosophy of the cathedral schools and then the universities, the philosophy of Anselm and Abelard and Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, was built on the Boethian foundation in ways that the schoolmen themselves acknowledged and that are visible on every page of their work. The logical vocabulary they used, the distinctions between substance and accident, between genus and species, between form and matter, between actuality and potentiality, was the vocabulary that Boethius had transmitted from the Greek tradition into Latin. The logical methods they employed, the syllogism, the technique of objection and response, the practice of beginning an argument by stating the opposing position as precisely as possible before refuting it, were the methods that Boethius had made available through his translations and commentaries. The model of theological reasoning as a combination of revealed doctrine and philosophical analysis, faith-seeking understanding in Anselm's famous formulation, was a model that Boethius had pioneered in the Opuscula Sacra, the specific problem that generated the most important philosophical debate of the early medieval period, the problem of universals, the question of whether general terms like humanity or whiteness referred to genuinely existing things or merely to concepts or words, was introduced into Latin philosophy by Boethius's commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge, in which he raised the question explicitly and suggested several possible answers without definitively resolving it. This philosophical problem, which might seem technical and remote from practical philosophical concerns, turned out to be one of the most fundamental and most productive questions in the history of philosophy, generating the great controversy between realists and nominalists that animated the schools for centuries and that ultimately contributed to the intellectual climate in which modern science and modern philosophy developed. Boethius's influence on the specific philosophical method of scholasticism. The quaestio disputata, the formal structure of posing a question, presenting objections, stating the resolution, and responding to objections, was also decisive. This method, which became the characteristic form of scholastic philosophical and theological writing, is a refinement of the dialogue method of the consolation, applied to the formal academic context of the medieval university. The consolation showed that philosophical understanding was produced through the engagement of objection and response, through the willingness to state the opposing position as strongly as possible before attempting to refute it, through the recognition that genuine philosophical progress required genuine philosophical challenge rather than the mere statement of conclusions. The scholastic method formalized this insight into a pedagogical and scholarly practice that shaped the entire intellectual culture of the medieval university. The long arc of Boethian influence reaches, through the scholastic tradition, into the intellectual formation that produced both the scientific revolution and the philosophical enlightenment. The nominalism that developed from the medieval debate about universals, the position associated with William of Ockham, that general terms do not refer to independently existing entities, but only to individual things collected under a common name, contributed to the intellectual climate in which the empirical and mathematical approach to nature that we call the scientific revolution became conceivable. The rigorous philosophical analysis of concepts and arguments that the scholastic tradition developed from the Boethian logical inheritance provided the methodological tools that Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant used in constructing the philosophical frameworks of the modern period. Boethius built the philosophical infrastructure of medieval Europe, and through that infrastructure he helped to shape the intellectual world that succeeded it. Part 18. The Complete Vision, Integration and Contemporary Application. Boethius's philosophy, taken as a whole across the Consolation, the logical works and the theological opuscula, forms a vision of human intellectual and moral life that is coherent, demanding, and as relevant to the 21st century as it was to the 6th. Its coherence derives from a single organizing conviction that runs through every part of the work, that the human mind, properly cultivated and properly applied, can find in the most adverse of circumstances a clarity about what genuinely matters that is not available from the comfortable perspective of fortune's favor, and that this clarity, once achieved, constitutes the most genuine form of happiness available to a finite, rational creature. The Consolation's central philosophical contribution to contemporary life is the practice of what might be called philosophical inventory, the systematic examination, at moments of loss or adversity or simply of honest reflection, of which things one genuinely needs for genuine happiness, and which things one has confused with genuine goods, because fortune provided them, and their loss would be painful. This examination is not a cheerful exercise in positive thinking. It is a demanding philosophical practice that requires genuine honesty about the gap between what one desires and what one genuinely needs, between the goods that fortune provides and the good that constitutes genuine happiness. The examination is most productive precisely when it is hardest, when fortune has taken something that seemed indispensable, and the question of whether genuine happiness is still available becomes urgent and cannot be answered from a comfortable, theoretical distance. The second contribution is the Boethian understanding of the providential order and its relationship to apparent disorder and injustice. The contemporary world provides an abundance of examples of what looks, from within the temporal perspective of any individual life, like radical disorder, the triumph of the corrupt, the suffering of the innocent, the arbitrary operation of forces that seem indifferent to any distinction between what human beings deserve and what they receive. The consolation does not dissolve these examples or explain them away. It argues, with philosophical seriousness, that the perspective from which they look like evidence of disorder is not the only available perspective, and that the philosophical discipline of maintaining a broader perspective, of refusing to allow the immediate emotional verdict of the temporal observer to be the final verdict, is both intellectually honest and practically transformative. The third contribution is the Boethian model of how to engage with intellectual adversity, how to approach the problems that seem intractable, the contradictions that seem irresolvable, the questions that seem unanswerable, with the philosophical patience and philosophical precision that genuine inquiry requires. The problem of foreknowledge and freedom that the consolation addresses is a problem that had seemed irresolvable, a conflict between two things that both seemed true and that seemed unable to be reconciled. Boethius's response was not to abandon one of the terms of the conflict or to declare the conflict irresolvable. It was to examine the concepts involved with greater precision, to ask whether the apparent conflict was generated by an assumption that could be questioned, and to pursue the implications of questioning that assumption as far as they would go. This philosophical method, the method of dissolving apparent contradictions by examining the assumptions that generate them, is one of the most productive methods in philosophy, and Boethius's application of it to the foreknowledge problem is one of its most impressive historical demonstrations. The fourth contribution is the specifically Boethian understanding of the relationship between philosophical formation and political engagement, the conviction that the person who has genuinely pursued philosophical wisdom has both the capacity and the obligation to bring that wisdom to bear on the governance of the community, accepting the risks that engagement entails rather than retreating into comfortable philosophical privacy. This is a demanding position, and the consolation makes clear that it is demanding, that the philosophical person who enters political life accepts the full range of fortune's operations, including the possibility of complete catastrophe. But the conviction that philosophical withdrawal is not the right response to a world in which governance matters enormously and in which those without philosophical formation are always available to fill the space left by those who retreat. This conviction has both philosophical depth and practical urgency. The fifth contribution is the consolation's treatment of friendship and human relationship as genuine goods that belong to a different category from fortune's gifts, goods that are partially within fortune's power, since fortune can take the friend by death or separation, but that are also partially beyond it, because the qualities that constitute genuine friendship, the mutual recognition of genuine virtue, the shared orientation toward genuine goods, the particular form of love that genuine friendship involves, are qualities of persons rather than of circumstances, and cannot be entirely dissolved by the changes that fortune produces. The consolation's prisoner has left behind, in the world outside his prison, a wife, children, friends, and colleagues who are suffering because of what has happened to him. His grief about their suffering is genuine and philosophically acknowledged, but the argument of the consolation implies that what was genuinely good about those relationships, the genuine love, the genuine recognition, the genuine shared commitment to what mattered, was not among the things that fortune has taken. The sixth contribution is the model of philosophical writing as a total engagement, a form of writing that addresses the whole person rather than merely the intellect, that combines rigorous philosophical argument with literary imagination, that uses the resources of poetry and myth and dramatic personification to prepare and illuminate the philosophical arguments, rather than merely decorating them. The Consolation is not a philosophical treatise with some poetry attached. It is a unified philosophical work in which every element, the dramatic situation, the figure of Lady Philosophy, the alternation of prose and verse, the sequence of arguments, the mythological allusions, is in the service of the philosophical purpose. This understanding of philosophical writing as total engagement is one of the most practically relevant of Boethius's contributions, because it offers a model for philosophical communication that does not require the separation of philosophical rigor from human accessibility, that demonstrates that the most demanding philosophical arguments can be made in forms that engage the imagination and the emotions as well as the intellect. The seventh and final contribution is the one that the Consolation most centrally and most powerfully makes: the demonstration that genuine philosophy can be practiced in the most adverse of circumstances, that the love of wisdom is not a fair-weather pursuit that requires comfort and security and adequate time for reflection, but a genuine capacity of the human mind that can be exercised wherever and whenever a mind is willing to exercise it. Boethius wrote The Consolation in a prison cell. He wrote it knowing that he would be executed. He wrote it without his library, without his colleagues, without the instruments of the scholar's craft. He wrote it in the shadow of an injustice that he knew was real and that he had no power to reverse. And what he produced in those conditions is one of the great works of Western philosophy, a work that has consoled and illuminated and challenged readers for 15 centuries, and that continues to do so in every age that produces readers capable of facing the fundamental contingency of human life with both philosophical honesty and philosophical courage. Conclusion: the courage to think clearly in the dark. We began with a man in a prison cell, stripped of everything that his world said mattered, writing a philosophical dialogue between himself and the spirit of wisdom he had spent his life cultivating. We end with a question. What do you do with this philosophy? How do you take Boethius's radical, demanding, unflinching vision and use it to live and think better in the specific circumstances of your actual life, which almost certainly does not include a prison cell and an imminent execution, but which includes its own specific configurations of loss, contingency, and the question of what, when everything is examined honestly, genuinely matters? The answer begins with a form of intellectual honesty that is both simpler and harder than it sounds. You are not, in all probability, pursuing genuine happiness. You are pursuing fortune's goods, wealth, status, professional achievement, social recognition, physical comfort. In the unseen belief that these goods constitute or lead to genuine happiness. This is not a moral indictment. It is a philosophical observation about how the human desire for genuine happiness gets redirected by convention, by advertising, by the social pressure of comparison and competition toward things that provide genuine pleasure and genuine convenience, but are structurally incapable of providing the genuine completeness that the desire for happiness is actually seeking. The Consolation's invitation is not to abandon the pursuit of happiness, but to be honest about what the pursuit is actually pursuing, and whether the specific goods being chased are capable of providing it. This requires a kind of philosophical courage that is different from the courage Diogenes demanded, or the courage that Hobbes's vision required, or the courage that Pythagoras's mathematical vision asked for. It is not the courage to live without conventional goods, or to face the state of nature honestly, or to hear the harmony of the cosmos. It is the courage to think clearly in the dark, to apply philosophical rigor to your own situation when your situation is at its worst, to refuse the comfort of conventional wisdom and conventional consolation when those comforts cannot survive philosophical examination, to follow the argument wherever it leads, even when following it requires acknowledging that the things you have worked hardest to build and maintain are not what you thought they were. But this philosophical courage does not require the extreme circumstances of Boethius's prison cell to be genuinely available or genuinely productive. The version of Boethian practice available to most people in most circumstances is something more modest and more sustainable. The regular practice of examining what genuinely constitutes well-being in one's actual life, the honest acknowledgement of the difference between the goods that fortune provides and the goods that constitute genuine flourishing, the cultivation of the interior resources, genuine friendship, genuine virtue, genuine philosophical understanding, that fortune's reversals cannot take, and the willingness to treat every reversal that does occur not merely as a misfortune to be survived, but as a philosophical opportunity to discover what, in the most honest accounting, survives the reversal. Boethius would say that most people live in a state of philosophical confusion about what they most want and where to find it. The confusion is not a moral failing. It is the natural product of a social world that consistently and systematically identifies fortune's gifts with genuine goods, that treats the accumulation of external success as the measure of genuine flourishing, that offers no philosophical framework for distinguishing between what fortune gives and what genuinely constitutes happiness. The consolation provides that framework, not as a set of doctrines to be passively accepted, but as a set of arguments to be actively engaged, tested against experience, and applied to the specific confusions of the specific life in which they are encountered. The woman who appears in the prison cell, ancient, authoritative, maternal, intellectually commanding, speaking in the voice of the longest and deepest tradition of philosophical reflection on what genuinely matters, is not a hallucination or a literary device in any merely decorative sense. She is the philosophical formation speaking, the capacity for philosophical reflection that Boethius had cultivated across a lifetime of serious philosophical engagement, making itself available to him in the circumstances where it was most needed. The consolation's central philosophical claim is that this capacity, the capacity for genuine philosophical reflection on what genuinely matters, is available to any person who has cultivated it in any circumstances, including the worst. That it does not depend on fortune. That it is, in the most precise philosophical sense, genuinely ours. Lady Philosophy came to a prison cell in Pavia in approximately 524 CE, and found there a mind capable of the most rigorous philosophical engagement with the most fundamental questions. What she offered was not comfort in the ordinary sense. It was clarity. The clarity of a mind that has found, in the experience of losing everything, the philosophical insight that genuine happiness was never located in the things that were lost. The insight cost Boethius everything. It has consoled and illuminated readers for 15 centuries. The cell is empty now. The light is still on,